What if Germany won World War I? This question would define early Hearts of Iron 4 modding, as nearly every mod had decided to ask this question but change the country. This tradition was started by In the Name of the Tsar, where they asked, what if Russia won World War I? The question itself is extremely compelling, as the title promises that Russia comes out of the Great War as the victor, and therefore would cause a radically different world. While there was hope for the scenario to expand, the mod developers got a life and moved on. But if this mod was so beloved, why did two different attempts to work on this scenario eventually die out? In this video, I'll be providing my take on why In the Name of the Tsar had eventually petered out, providing my own version of the lore, which will hopefully inspire a third attempt at a revival. The lore of the original scenario was that a far more successful Brusilov offensive takes place, which causes a collapse in Austria-Hungary, therefore destroying the Central Powers' logistics and ultimately resulting in their capitulation. This would even lead to the collapse of Germany, where several new states would be carved out of the empire after its defeat, with the main gameplay element of this region being its reunification. The Germany content was paired with Russian content, where they struggled to keep their dominant position in the world, being held back by their lack of modernization. This had meant that the rest of the world had skeleton content, and while many were anticipating expansion of content to other regions, the developers were put into an impossible position with their lore. The foundation of their lore was always just the question, what if Russia won World War I? With the content people respected most being after effects of attempting to preserve Russian dominance by artificially turning its greatest rivals into warlords. By focusing on the end result, rather than focusing on a single point of divergence, the developers had pushed themselves into a hole, where any attempts to expand on the lore would need to be purely fictitious in order to serve the core of the mod, rather than the world naturally developing alongside the core, setting the foundations for every other nation. If this seems like an unfounded critique to you, I would just refer to the Redux version, where they attempted to justify the timeline and flesh out the world by providing a different point of divergence, the Russians winning in the Russo-Japanese War, but this would not give them the result they wanted. Anything less than a total victory by Russia in this war would be seen as a humiliation. But not only did they fail to achieve their aims, Russian territory and influence in Manchuria was conceded to the uncivilized Oriental Japanese. This defeat was a wake-up call for Russia to modernize. Brusilov's doctrinal innovations may never have been accepted by the Russian military without their tactics being proven faulty after their defeat. This wake-up call would also lead to their westernization attempts by establishing a parliament known as the Duma and beginning industrialization projects. If you're interested in learning more about this argument, US of Z has made a great video about this idea. If you want to see that video, check the link in the top right or in the description. So if the Redux's point of divergence wasn't a good foundation, and the original lacks proper depth, what should the lore be instead? Well, stay tuned, as your estranged LoreDad throws his own cannon into the ring. In this case, the original idea of a Brusilov offensive succeeding, causing a Russian total victory, is a good start, but then we're stuck with the same problem the original mod had. The Brusilov offensive would have destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army, and potentially even the state itself, if it were not for the Germans intervening. The original concept of the mod ignores this fact, or even insists that the German reinforcement is overtaken, despite them defending against an under-equipped, poorly organized Russian army. Taking this assumption to be true, that the German reinforcement was the only thing preventing the Russians from eliminating Austria-Hungary, the only thing that we would need to do is delay or prevent these reinforcements from arriving in Galicia. There are many ways we could do this, like strengthening the Western Entente to the point where Germany needs to commit more troops westwards. The easiest way we could accomplish this is by having Roosevelt become the leader of the United States of America during the Great War. In our timeline, Roosevelt had sought a third non-consecutive term as the Republican candidate, after his successor, Taft, had failed to meet his standards. After being rebuked by the Republicans in the Leadership Convention of 1912, he would found the Progressive Party. This party divided the Republican vote, giving the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. When the Lusitania, a civilian ship which housed several Americans, was sunk by German submarines, the Americans did not intervene according to Wilson's isolationism. Therefore, we need to make sure that an interventionist like Roosevelt would be in charge. Having the Progressive Party, which was established months before the election, gain a majority, have Roosevelt wrestle his former political allies of the Republican Party, and manage the hostile Democratic Party, is really implausible. Instead, we'll have Roosevelt win the Republican convention, eliminating the possibility for Taft to have a second term of presidency. This could be accomplished with another earlier point of divergence. The exact details we won't define, is to give our American lore flexibility to suit a better scenario. Our primary focus is Russia, so we'll turn our eyes back to Europe. Even without American involvement in the beginning of the conflict, the simple threat of their involvement would dictate a stronger focus on the Western Front. This diversion of attention would allow for Brusilov's offensive to succeed with greater success than our history. But instead of having Austria-Hungary collapse completely, we're going to have the Sixtus Affair succeed. In our timeline, Charles had attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Entente. He wished to concede Transylvania to Romania, the Vojvodina to Serbia, and recognizes France's claim to Alsace-Lorraine. This would ultimately be unsuccessful, but in this timeline, with Russia utterly destroying their army, this would be the only move the Habsburgs could make to preserve their state. Thus, we'll have the Austrians defecting to the Entente. This would be simply unacceptable for the Hungarians, who would seek to continue the conflict on the Central Powers' side. Thus, the Russians and Austrians would crush the Hungarians, a historical rhyme with the 1848 rebellions, but with a further benefit to Russia, as they would gain Carpathian Ruthenia, incorporating the Rusyns into their state. By crushing Hungarian secession, the Austro-Hungarians would grant autonomy to the Slavic minorities being suppressed in their state, with a rump Danubian federation being established in its stead, granting Russia a buffer with the West, increasing their soft power, and turning a former foe into an ally against the Germans. Thus, with 6 great powers all turned against the Central Powers, it was only a matter of time before they surrendered. The Bulgarians would have joined the war just early enough to lose their remaining Aegean coastline to Greece, leaving the rest of Bulgaria to be occupied by Russia, turning them into a satellite state. With Russian presence in Bulgaria, they would be in a great position to occupy the Bosphorus Straits, which was actually promised to Russia by Britain during the Great War. While you may know of the Sykes-Picot Agreement of Britain and France in the division of power in the Middle East, initial Entente designs granted significant concessions to Russia and Italy. Russia sought to expand their territories in western Armenia, but most importantly, they wanted to annex the Bosphorus Straits and reclaim Constantinople for Orthodoxy. This latter stipulation would be known as the Constantinople Agreement. Besides the ultimate conclusion to the Russo-Turkish rivalry, which had lasted centuries, it would also grant Russia access to the Mediterranean, a significant strategic benefit that would significantly impact the geopolitical balance of power, potentially too far in favor of Russia. The British would attempt to revise the Constantinople Agreement by transforming the territories initially promised to Russia into an international zone. This would give Russia the economic benefit of trade through the Mediterranean, but would also mean that the international community would determine whether or not Russia was able to transport its navy through the region. But whether or not Russia or the greater international community controls the straits, there's a big elephant in the room. How far would this partition of the Ottoman Empire even go? With early American intervention in the conflict, the USA did not have the influence to demand things like Wilson's 14 Points had, allowing for European imperialism to become absolutely ruthless in their partition. France and Britain would gain their annexations and zones of influence in the Fertile Crescent and in Anatolia, while Italy gets the south of Anatolia. Taking one look at this partition should immediately trigger immense skepticism. Christian European powers carving out the Middle East with such overt annexations would not be sustainable, especially allowing the Ottomans to exist purely in the northern Beyliks, as if avoiding a full annexation would be enough to avoid unrest throughout the rest of the empire. I really don't get that at all. As the Europeans began to enact their short-sighted partition of the Ottoman Empire, including a Greek annexation of Smyrna, the Turkish would begin to resist. In our history, when similar agreements were being negotiated, they fought a brutal war of independence against the Europeans. However, this war of resistance was funded and supported by the Soviet Union. In this timeline, Russia would be an active participant in their partition, leaving Turkish resistance without a benefactor. So if nothing could stop the Entente from executing their designs on the Ottomans, then what would become of Turkey by 1936? This is a very interesting problem for us to solve from a lore perspective, and I have a community member who suggested a brilliant solution. But we have a lot to cover before you witness the fate of the territories of the Ottoman Empire. So we'll keep the Entente's initial ideas for the Ottoman partition to be implemented before it's inevitably revised. Now, we'll turn our attention to the final member of the Central Powers, Germany. Completely surrounded by stable and victorious powers, and their largest allies betraying them, the German Empire would have no choice but to surrender. This results in a peace treaty similar to Versailles, with France reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine and demilitarized zones impacting their ability to station troops in bordering territories. But it would need to be different in the east, as Russia would be alive, well, and seeking to expand. And they could justify these annexations through the establishment of a viceroyalty of Poland. While Russia has had its problems with Polish autonomous regions in the past, it's known that the commander-in-chief of the Russian army had promised the Poles an autonomous state under the scepter of the Russian Tsar, free in faith, language, and self-rule. In this peace treaty, Russia would grant Poznan and the Polish-majority regions of southern Prussia to their Polish viceroyalty. While this seems pretty tame, especially given the gains of the British and the French, there would be reasonable concerns for the stability of the region if Russia and Poland were to gain everything that they were hoping for. So while Russia would only gain a small amount of territory from Germany, it would end the Great War with an unprecedented victory. But this conclusion to the Great War would be unacceptable to the German people, and the quick successes of the Brusilov offensive, and therefore the lack of a communist agitator like Lenin being in Russia, would not eliminate the rise of radical socialism in the world, and especially not Germany. If anything, it would make it worse, with the humiliation of defeat, the economic strain of war followed by extortionate war operations, the continued existence of the Kaiser in Germany, and the lack of a Soviet model revolution in the East would all inspire the revolutionary socialists of Germany, ranging from social democrats like Friedrich Ebert, Spartacists like Rosa Luxemburg, and vanguardists like Ernst Thälmann, to all work together to liberate Germany from the monarchy and found the first socialist state of the world. Changing the fate of Germany from balkanization to a unified communist revolution is a radical departure from the original lore, but the advent of this communist state would trigger ripple effects through the entire world in a way that leads to a far more compelling Hearts of Iron 4 scenario. The original mod's timeline has southern Germany falling to communists and being pushed back by the French to be isolated in Bavaria, allowing for France to maintain a new buffer state in the south, in tandem with their northern buffer state of the Rhine. But in this revised timeline, France would have no buffer states, only demilitarized zones. Once order in Germany would have collapsed, France would have the impetus to occupy these regions directly, seeking to establish a new order in the region. This is when our iconic Rhinish buffer state would be made, but France would lack the capability to push beyond the Rhine to contain the communist revolution. While France was able to begin recovery thanks to the war operations and trade with Germany, they now lacked both these things, and their war-exhausted public would resist any mobilization attempts, or even worse, join sympathetic socialist parties to threaten their own revolution at home. Western Europe would be under high alert and at risk to falling to revolution, but would remain mostly stable due to their developed economies and democratic institutions allowing for moderate socialists to join parties rather than becoming revolutionary. But both of these things did not exist in Russia, causing their attempts to neutralize the revolution in Germany to be extremely ineffective, with every soldier sent to the front line being extremely susceptible to defection. Despite Russia's victory in the war, and their beginnings of modernization due to the Russo-Japanese War's defeat, Russia's aristocracy would once again become complacent, content with their limited reforms, and rejoice in their newfound prosperity through war operations and territorial acquisitions. Meanwhile, the soldiers and the peasants who had toiled for Russia barely gained any freedoms or wealth. Every single problem that Russia had that the Bolsheviks had provided radical solutions for would still exist, and so too every Bolshevik that would rally behind Lenin to execute the revolution in our history would either consciously or subconsciously sympathize with the German communists in this timeline. The only thing that would prevent a total collapse of authority into a Russian civil war would be the unifying figure of Lenin, who would be incapable of returning home to Russia to instigate a revolution there. Instead, he would simply cross the border of Switzerland into the revolutionary German state and offer his support, connecting with Russian communist cells to coordinate the local revolutionary forces. Russia would once again face another crisis, one that would be far more disruptive of a wake-up call than being defeated by the Japanese. Instead, the victory that Brusilov's offensives had afforded them, which they thought was a natural consequence of the reforms, was revealed to be a lucky break, and that Russia could not afford to adopt half-measure reforms to survive this onslaught. Therefore, Russia would need to truly modernize, and the man for the job would be Pavel Milyukov. Pavel's cadets, while liberal, would seek to collaborate with the monarchy and reform Russia along the lines of the British and German empires. The first step of modernization would be to shift the role of the Duma in the Russian state. Rather than being an advisor to the Tsar, the Duma would govern with the Tsar's blessing. The members of the Duma would be elected by the citizens of Russia, with suffrage being granted to any Russian male and the potential of female suffrage being on the horizon. But while the cadets would be champions of ensuring constitutional rights like freedom of speech, association, religion, and equality before the law, their policy on land reform would be insufficient. The cadets would seek to improve the lives of the peasants and truly rid Russia of the economic legacy of serfdom, but would only, legally, be able to do so by purchasing the land from willing landlords. This reform would be slow, expensive, and may not be enough to truly modernize Russia in time for the Hearts of Iron IV start date. However, I believe that these reforms would be enough to prevent Russia's collapse into a civil war. Russia's home front would survive, but they would be incapable of suppressing the communist Germans, only being able to extend their strategic buffer by collaborating with separatist Poles in Germany in an analog to the greater Polish uprisings of 1918 and 1919, with the remaining German Empire loyalists remaining exiled in Prussia proper. Due to themselves being surrounded by and protected by the Russian Empire, they would become a de facto satellite state, further expanding Russian influence in Europe, but allowing for the communist Germans to remain with their largest industrial centers uncontested, allowing for them to recuperate and develop a military that would certainly push the world into a second world war. Russia and the rest of Europe allowing for the communist Germans to survive is severely implausible if observed through a vacuum. However, every major Entente power would have been facing significant unrest in their Ottoman territories in tandem with the German Revolution. When we last talked about Turkey, we discussed the benefits and disadvantages of following the original lore concept. There is a spectacular suggestion made by Sogut Falk in the Discord server, which would make for a very interesting conflict of the region and solves all the problems that we have plausibility-wise. While the regional annexations and influence between Britain and France in the Fertile Crescent would remain, the Turkish majority Ilyats in Anatolia would face significant unrest. Unless, of course, there was a puppet regime that maintained legitimacy. This couldn't be possible unless the government was organized in Istanbul, so the conclusion is simple. The Ottoman Empire would need to persist, its government would need to be in Istanbul, but would be extremely weak. Aliyat warlords with different European benefactors would extract wealth and resources from them indirectly, all while the International Straits Zone ensures that the rump Ottoman Empire's government collaborates with their interests. This setup should keep things stable enough just in time for our favorite year, 1936. After which, the regional warlords may form rival national governments in their attempts to reunify, especially as the European nations begin to fight each other in a second world war. But what would it look like? How would the aftermath of the German Revolution impact the geopolitics of the world? Will America keep its Roosevelt bull moose interventionism? Or will America recede into isolationism? If this video gets 5,000 likes, I'll explore this timeline further, offering my completed 1936 scenario, including paths and victory scenarios for all the different factions. Thank you very much to my channel members. Look both ways before you cross the street, and I hope you have a good day.